shale and sandstone soils that are eroded into the rivers around Stillwater were covered with cotton at one time. And so we've got a long history of cotton if you look back far enough. And so it's a crop that's well adapted for a lot of the state. But then we would talk about and re-educate ourselves with irrigation needs throughout the state. So this is a picture from the Mesonet. This is evapotranspiration. These numbers and evapotranspiration and water dynamics in the agricultural sector is interesting because we can estimate the amount of water that could be evapotranspired by a fully dense alfalfa crop if it was growing year round. That's what that number means, meaning it's not cut down and it's not limiting in its ability to transpire water. And that's what that number is 90 inches is what the atmospheric demand for water from a green growing crop would be. And you get over here in eastern Oklahoma, it's 60, down in the southwest it's 80 to 90, and up in the north it's around 70. So our atmospheric water demand is pretty freaking high. And that's just the nature of the beast, living in an environment. Of course, it changes from east to west and north to south. And that's not the irrigation requirement. This is more of the evapotranspiration for a cotton crop. And on these scenarios I put together is a May 15th planting in all these locations. And then I cut off the ET on October 17th. But the evapotranspiration demand for cotton in the Panhandle is about 36 inches, 32 inches, 27 inches up in Blackwell, and over here in Haskell it's 26 inches. So you get, as much of as a 10-inch spread in the amount of water that would be required to grow a fully irrigated, unlimited growth crop in cotton. But that's not the irrigation demand either, right? Because you've got rainfall. And so we can look at the water deficit, which is the ET minus rainfall. Also varies as a function of location. And again, here is when you look at the in-season rainfall and the in-season evapotranspiration and take the difference, that's what these numbers are. And so out in the Panhandle, you're looking at 27 inches or 19 inches, 12 inches. And then 6 inches up in Blackwell. And this is a striking number because there's guys out in the eastern half of the state that irrigate and they may be running 10 inches of irrigation, but your actual water deficit is really only 6 inches if you look at a 15-year average data set. And the reason that is because we're irrigating in these more humid environments to negate stress during very short periods of water limit. And so we might irrigate more than that, but on an average you really should only need 6 inches based on the difference between ET and rainfall. And then out here, and to be honest, the way this data was calculated on a 15-year average, these numbers are probably more accurate with respect to soil water deficit because these numbers assume little or no drainage or runoff in season, and that's not the case because we're getting so much more rain. We get some portion of that goes off in runoff. In contrast, you get out here in Altus or Guymon, and those environments, your runoff from rainfall is very limited even under irrigation because it's such a smaller component of the water cycle than what you have here. And so these are a little misleading, but I leave them in there the way it is just for simplicity and just kind of to give an idea of the discrepancy sometimes between what we could capture from rainfall and what we do capture from rainfall and their irrigation, the resulting irrigation that we're applying. Typical season irrigation needs. So this is the ET minus rainfall. That's all that is. And that's not irrigation requirement because irrigation requirement also takes into account your stored soil moisture, right? So out here, we're not going to pump 27 inches of water in the Panhandle onto cotton. We don't really pump that on corn anymore. And corn's a water hog compared to cotton. And down here, we typically don't see 19 inches going on the cotton because we have what we call stored soil moisture. This is probably when we account for the soil's capacity to give up moisture after a spring or winter recharge. This is probably closer to what we might see on a 15-year average irrigation requirement, about 20 inches in the Panhandle, 4.5 there at Chickasha, 14 there in Altus, and then just 1.5 inches in Blackwell if you could capture all the rain that falls in season, which you can't, and then 5 inches over in Haskell. So irrigation requirements, like I say, it's not simply determined by the ET minus rain. Your soil water holding capacity and preseason rainfall are important, and the preseason rainfall impacts our starting point. And this is, I put this in here so when we look at irrigation, we look at a lot of different things. We look at our soil water deficit, and then as we proceed into this presentation, we'll start putting irrigation events in there that keeps that deficit from going extreme. But these graphs are meant to represent if the crop could pull the water out of the ground, which it can't because you'll hit permanent wilting point at some point. But if you could pull water out of the ground starting at completely full, and based on the rainfall and ET, this is how much water and this is the distribution at which it would be pulled. This is pretty much like a cumulative ET curve, but I put it in this format so that we could take a look at this stuff going on in Blackwell and Chickasha. But here's Goodwell, here's Altus, and the things that are striking is you see there in Goodwell is the day you plant, you're going to start using more water than you're receiving by rainfall, and that's going to increase in its rate of extraction until you hit a maximum rate of extraction there in August. In Altus, you can plant there in the middle of May, and you can go for about a month or two, month and a half until about the end of June, with really no net requirement for irrigation. And that's what you'll see in the Altus district. They don't typically start irrigating until about the 1st of July. Although, you know, some of the drought years, they try to turn it on back in May or June, but typically their average target start date is there at the end of June, 1st of July. And then when we get over here to Chickasha or Blackwell, what you see are these large positive zones. And what that is, and this is very striking because we got a lot of irrigation up around Blackwell in Kay County and in that area. In fact, it's, you know, it is dwarfed by the irrigation in these two areas, but this would be probably a 3rd or 4th ranked region for irrigation in Oklahoma. But you see, this is all the rain that we receive after planting on May 15th on average. That's how much rain we receive in excess of crop requirement. It's pretty striking, and that's why I put it. And then Chickasha, you know, you receive a couple inches more than the crop requires. And then you add to that those plumes after planting, the rainfall off season. There in Chickasha through the winter months, you're receiving about 15 inches. Goodwell's 7, Altus is 11, and Blackwell is 13. So on average, we should start the season with a fairly good profile. If we're irrigating, and we'll start irrigating here in a few slides, but in these regions, for sure, we start out with a good profile in these regions as long as we have managed the water to physiological maturity in such a way it doesn't drop down much more than 7 inches or 11 inches. We'll typically get a good amount of recharge outside of droughts and stuff that we can discuss. So anyway, now it brings us, I've kind of hem-hawed around to a condition where we're actually going to start pumping water. And this graph is from Altus. So this is evapotranspiration and rainfall data from Altus. And then it's got some soil information here in the form of this line, which is a 50% of field capacity. So that's the amount of water that this Hollister silty clay loam can hold. That's equivalent to 50% of field capacity. 50% Field capacity, of course, is the amount of water that soil can hold against the pull of gravity. And then we can draw that profile down to 50% of that value, typically without having crop stress. And if we draw it down below that, then we're going to have crop stress, right? And so we can get along really well. And what I've done here is, for anybody looking at irrigating cotton that hasn't done it before, the reason I put this up is these are well capacities in gallons per minute per acre, or just gallons per minute on a 125 acre circle. But these values tell us that typically with any volume of water or capacity of water greater than 3.2 gallons per minute per acre, we can keep up with cotton and Altus on average. And that's, again, average. And Jeff Scott told me one time that the average doesn't mean much. It's the variance that'll kill you. And so we do need some buffer. And you see here at the 3.2 gallons per minute, we still got about 2 inches worth of buffer. So at peak ET, which is occurring about right here, we can lose another 2 inches in this condition through excess evapotranspiration or less than average rainfall, and still keep up at 3.2 gallons per minute. But if you're getting down to these really low capacity systems of 0.8 or 1.6 gallons per minute per acre, then you're going to run out of gas, and you're going to hit this threshold at which you're going to have crop stress. And that gets us to, and we'll slide through just for completion. This is for Blackwell. And so in Blackwell, we're running 400 gallon a minute wells. That's more than plenty for cotton. In fact, you're typically going to spend a lot of time turning them on and off, because that's here you get this big plume of water that's all drained out of the system because we are not using it. It's either going towards soil profile recharge, or it's running off site or being drained through the system. And then all these squiggly lines here that are approaching zero right here, that means that with all those well capacities, we can keep up with crop ET very readily, and we can end the season with as much water in the profile as we wanted, as we started. And when you, in this environment, giving this graph, do you need to stop, or do you need to end your season with your soil profile water at that level, equal to what it was at the beginning of the year? No. You need to keep it. And that's where this is the crop ET. We're keeping up with crop ET, but we don't need to irrigate that much. In this condition, this is where we would pump 5 inches against the average. And of course, the average is convoluted, because if you look at 15 years worth of average rainfall data, it'll tell you that it rains a little bit every day, because you're taking one event on July 4th, and you're averaging, it may be 1.4 inches, you're averaging over 15 years. That means you're getting 1,400 or a tenth of an inch on July 4th in this data. So it's not quite real, because it doesn't take into the full variance, but it does provide us a little conceptual construct to understand that we don't want to pump so much water that we end full, because we're going to get this big plume of water that's going to recharge our profile. And then if we're running at real low capacities, we can keep up with demand typically, except for in the case of a drought or prolonged period of lack of rain or excessive ET. And again, you know, we can deal with the averages. Here's Chickasha again. You can very easily keep up with 400 gallon a minute well on a circle, but very similar to Altus. Despite the fact that this environment is cooler, their ET or atmospheric water demand is not as high. But what's different about Chickasha is we're on this Dale silt loam, and according to the numbers, this Dale silt loam can hold a mountain of water to 4 feet. This is actually the soil water holding capacity at a foot, at 50% of water holding capacity, and this is down to 4 feet. And so that silt loam, and that's another story, is that when we talk about irrigation management and irrigation strategies, that soil type is very important. If you look here at this Hollister, we're looking at around 4 to to 4.5 inches of water holding capacity above 50% field capacity. But then you get to this beautiful Dale silt loam and you're looking at closer to 6. And that means you've got 6 inches to play with before you get crop stress. And that is the way that curve is designed, is during that first 30 days, you assume that crop can only explore about a foot of soil. And then as you get rapid growth and root development, your rooting depth and your effective water or your effective soil depth increases to somewhere down around 4 feet. Is if you have unrestricted root growth, you don't have any restricted layers and things like that. And in this Dale silt loam, you wouldn't. And then here's Guymon. Guymon, the scale is quite skewed, but it's still about 4 feet in this Groover clay loam, with about 4 to 4.5 inches of plant available or allowable water deficit. But because of the atmospheric water demand and lower rainfall, this 200 gallon minute well will nowhere come near to keeping up to this system. And even the 3.2 gallon per minute well won't keep up or keep us above that maximum allowable deficit. So I'll point out these are based on pure like daily time step water balances, and that's why they're so smooth. And this is something we can do with like drip irrigation. We can irrigate daily if we really wanted to fine-tune daily irrigation with a drip system. And we do this in Guymon on a research station. You can irrigate to crop ET exactly every day, and you can create a true real water budget like this. But typically with a pivot or like flood irrigation, we're gonna have cycles like this. And I put this in here because these cycles change things a little bit, because you'll have, on a 5-day, these are representing 3 gallons per minute and then 4.8 gallons per minute. So with this 3 gallons per minute per acre, you're gonna have these cycles, and it's gonna dip down below that threshold of maximum allowable deficit, and then it's gonna be brought up, and then it's gonna dip down, and you're gonna cycle through. And if you have a nice silty clay loam with exceptional water holding capacity, you're going to get along just fine with that. In contrast, if you put more sand in that soil, you have a sandier texture soil, you lose water holding capacity to where you only have 11/100ths of an inch per inch is what that number is. This is 23/100ths of an inch per inch water holding capacity. This is 11/100ths of an inch per inch, and then this 5/100ths of an inch per inch of water holding capacity in the top 4 feet. You can see that even with 600 gallons a minute there in Altus, you're going to have periods of stress between irrigation events. And the aggravating thing about it is that it's not occurring back here in the early part of the season where you can handle a little stress without having problems. It's going to happen during peak ET where you're trying to make fruit. And so those are challenges you see. Another thing that can affect this discrepancy is if you have a lot of early spring or early season rain and growth or rainfall, and you over irrigate back here, you can cause some limitations to root growth, especially if you're in a clay soil that swells up real tight. And so when that thing swells, although it may have some level of elasticity, you may have some aeration problems that limit root growth and things like that. And so what you can see is early season excess moisture may prevent you from getting this effective rooting depth that we need to get down and have this flexibility in the soil water status. And so that brings us, I visited a little bit with Randy Bowman over the years, and then with Seth Bird about crop or like cotton crop requirement and irrigating the physiological condition. And this is really what I took from it. With some crops like milo, we can stress milo fairly well early and get by with it on the back end of things because it'll bounce back as long as we're fully watered at 30 days past planting. But what I took from talking to them is that we don't want to stress, and I put in quotation marks, stress cotton anytime during its development. If we are going to stress it, it wants to be up here in the early part of the season. But once we get into fruit development, we really don't want to stress it. We may have periodic stress, like where it kind of dips down and comes back up, but we don't want to get down below these lines. And there's partly two reasons. Is first, once you get down there, if it doesn't rain to help you get back, it's going to be a trouble, particularly if you're capacity limited, and that's a lot of what I do. But then also, if you stress it through the fruiting phase or the reproductive phase, and even early, you're going to delay its maturity, particularly as you're in the northern part of the state. Anything that you do to delay the maturity is going to be problematic. So we want to keep it going throughout the season, but we don't want to overwater it. And a lot of times we tend to fare on the side of overwatering things, particularly if we're not familiar with the crop, because we don't want it to burn up. But at the same time, that can actually be detrimental later in the season because we don't have that root growth and the resilience that deep root growth allows us. And so I would encourage you, I'm not going to get into a lot of irrigation schedulers and soil moisture sensors today because we could talk about that a lot. But I do want to plug this Mesonet irrigation tool. If you don't use any irrigation scheduling tools at all, I encourage you to look at this one. It's not particularly user-friendly, but it does give you crop-specific and site-specific evapotranspiration values, and it'll tell you how much it rained, so that you can do a water budget simply going back to the last time you had an irrigation event and looking at how much water deficit's been created, and that'll at least get you started. We're working with a lot of companies on our research farm in Guymon and hoping to start some things in Altus, where these companies have got very complex and pretty good, it appears to me, irrigation scheduling tools, if you're willing to pay for it, that are providing, soil water balances that take into account the atmospheric conditions, the soil type, the crop growth rate, and all these things, even incorporating and back calculating the effect of crop stress on the evapotranspiration in the future. And it's very fascinating because they took a lot of this science from land grants and ARS people, and they're putting it out in the marketplace with technology, like what John was talking about this morning. And now they're kind of bickering back and forth. It's like, well, how accurate it is. But it's more accurate. Well, I don't know if I'd say a 30-year-old or a farmer that's been growing cotton for 30 years under irrigation, I don't know if they're more accurate than that guy. But it's even going to provide him a little bit more insight, particularly with the root growth and soil moisture sensors. I think guys are realizing with using soil moisture sensors that if they don't start to see some fluctuation in their soil profile, then maybe they're too wet and they haven't really got good root exploration. And they're learning more and more about how the plant interacts with the soil moisture and how their irrigation management influences that. Because from an efficiency standpoint, we want to be able to deplete that profile so that then Mother Nature can fill it back up through the fallow period. And that increases our efficiency. A lot of times it goes towards increasing crop health as well, where you don't have a lot of excess wetness out there at the end of the season causing root rot problems and things like that. But this is a good tool to get you started. I know I talked to Wes about looking into improving the user interface to it, but there's so many products out there right now, of course you'd have to pay for them, that are superior to this. No offense to Wes. It's whether or not we want to spend the time making this what it needs to be. But if you really want more output from this, then let us know. So in summary, we must match our water availability and our soil water holding capacity to our crop need. That's pretty commonsensical, but a lot of times we're trying to water a crop, and I think we're loving it too much early, and then it's stressing late because we're not utilizing that deep moisture, and we need to think about that. And I think that's where soil moisture sensors can help us, is to better understand how water applications, whether it's irrigation or rainfall, influence that early season root growth and then our ability to keep up later. Because if we don't have that capacity to keep up with peak ET, that's where we can run into trouble. Allowing a moderate early season soil moisture deficit will increase root exploration, but stress can delay crop growth and potential yield, and really how quickly it can finish off. And then ET models and soil moisture sensors, like I say, can help us. I've had the pleasure working with like Nebraska corn farmers, and they're a pretty demanding group, and it's fascinating because they really are going towards the idea that these ET models and soil moisture sensors can run their irrigation systems, and that way they can go off and do something else with their time, market their grain or whatever. But I don't think they'll ever replace observations in the field. And maybe John's right, we can have drones and all those things going out there and looking at it, and I suppose we can someday. But we still need to have that assessment in the field of what that crop's doing, because this model only knows what we tell it, and that soil moisture sensor only knows how moist the soil is directly around it, maybe an area this big. You combine them and they get better, but we still need to be able to look at the field and look at the crop to see how it's performing. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. Mention it. Those water budgets assume no runoff, and they assume no drainage and 100% application efficiency, which, a drip irrigation system only gets you 98%. A low elevation sprinkler application gives you like 90%. So you would take those into account. And that's where particularly Blackwell is probably out of balance, because they've got their nozzles up here. It's probably more accurate for Altus and the Panhandle because they've dropped them down, and they don't get runoff or drainage.